I have to talk about something that happened this week. And all of a sudden, it was like on a national stage. It genuinely bothered me. Not for content, not like a performative aspect. It bothered me as a person with ADHD, as a father of a kid with ADHD, as somebody who spent years helping neurodivergent people understand their brains. So let's talk about it. The president of the United States stood in the Oval Office this week and said, and I'm quoting directly, "I think a president should not have learning disabilities. If you have that, that is not a good thing. Everything about him is dumb." That's what was said. And he's even said some version of that at least 4 times this week. And I've got to tell you, the injustice sensitivity and the ADHD, I have something to say about it. Let me be really clear about this first. This is not political. I genuinely do not care what party anybody's in. Doesn't matter to me. This is something bigger. The president is supposed to be something, a standard, a beacon, someone that kids, they look up to, on some level. And they think that person represents what's possible for me. I really want you to think about who heard this. Think about the 10-year-old, like my son, who got diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia. They're already fighting every day, who already goes home some nights wondering why everything feels so much harder for them. I remember being that kid just heard the president say they're not good enough to lead. Think about the parents in this audience. The parents fighting schools, fighting systems, really trying to fight the voice in their own kid's head that says, you're broken. Working every single day to replace that voice with a better voice, and this week, the president's voice, a loud voice, got there first. And I know from the work that I do, these words land, they do real damage. And this damage can take years to undo. So this needs to be answered, and with facts, not just feelings, but, actual facts. First, there was fundamental scientific error in like everything that was said. Learning disabilities, they're not about intelligence. They're not about IQ. They're not about how capable you are or anybody is. A learning disability means your brain processes certain types of information differently. Reading, writing, spelling, that's it. The Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity, they state directly, this is an opinion as like a scientific position, that dyslexia has no connection to a person's overall intelligence. None. Zero. The National Center for Learning Disabilities responded to these exact comments this week. They called them, again, I'm quoting directly, both factually and morally incorrect. They said learning disabilities, they don't reflect a person's intelligence at all, their judgment, or even their ability to lead, as he said. When the president equated learning disability with low IQ, that's just not being an insensitive dick. It's actually scientifically wrong. And this isn't the first time scientifically wrong stuff has been said. We know that. Here's the part that is really relevant to the community. All right. So dyslexia affects roughly 20% of the population, if I remember correctly, 1 in 5 people. And research shows that between 40 and 50% of people with dyslexia also have ADHD. Now, these conditions, they share common neurological ground. Both involve differences in how the brain's executive function system operates, but both involve differences in the dopamine regulation. They're not separate communities living separate lives. They deeply overlap groups of people whose brains are wired completely differently. And together, we're not a fringe group. We're tens of millions of people out there. That's a lot of people he's speaking to. So if learning disabilities disqualify somebody from some sort of leadership, we have a serious problem with history. Winston Churchill, he led Britain through World War II. He was one of the most consequential leaders of the 20th century, had dyslexia. He struggled severely in school. I remember one time I read that his teachers considered him one of their worst students, but then he went on and, he led a nation through the defining crisis of the modern um, era. Albert Einstein, he changed how humanity even understands the universe, dyslexia, and suspected ADHD. He didn't speak until he was 4. He was like asked to leave school, and I'm pretty sure his teachers said that he would never amount to anything. And then he developed the theory of relativities, the theory of relativity. So Sir Richard Branson's another good one. He built Virgin, also Virgin Airlines, music. He went to space. He owns like hundreds of companies, also dyslexic and ADHD, left school at 16. And he said publicly and repeatedly that dyslexia is what gave him the ability to like see the big picture when everyone else in the room was like stuck on all the details and stuff, So he always thought of this as basically an advantage. Steve Jobs built Apple from a garage into the most valuable company in history, ADHD. We watch all of his movies. Walt Disney, told by his own teachers, he lacked imagination and would never amount to anything, if I remember correctly. Also had dyslexia. He then built an entertainment empire that hundreds of years later still pretty much defines all childhoods for the most part on the entire planet. Henry Ford, dyslexic, built Ford Motor Company. I don't care how you feel about Ford, but built Ford Motor Company. And I mean, he essentially changed how the world moves around. And then there's this one, and, sit with this one. Woodrow Wilson, the 28th president of the United States, leader of a country. Historians, they documented that based on accounts from his childhood, that Wilson almost certainly had dyslexia. He always struggled to read. I think it was till around 10 is when he actually learned to read. He had significant difficulty with like written language throughout his entire life. And he became the president of the United States. I mean, and we're not talking about like good or bad. That's all opinion, right? But he became the president of the United States. So the premise that a person with a learning disability, can't hold that office is like, it's scientifically wrong. It's historically disproven. It's literally already happened in the same building he's in. That's even crazier. Let me say something carefully. And I'm not trying to diagnose anyone. That's not what I'm trying to do. That's not what I do anyways. But the irony here, it's worth kind of naming directly and pointing out that the person making this statement has been publicly described by his own longtime ghostwriter, like the person who co-wrote The Art of the Deal with him. And this person spent a ton of time with him as somebody who never read a book. His ghostwriter said that, this wasn't a critic. This was his ghostwriter, somebody who worked with him like on a daily basis in this capacity, and according to multiple reported accounts from people actually inside his own White House, staff has discussed among themselves his difficulty in processing long written documents. And he actually has a really strong preference for getting information through the television or like conversation rather than reading it. I don't know how true this is. This is just conversation, but, I'm not saying what that means or diagnosing, but what I am saying is if the person saying neurodivergent people cannot lead is himself kind of navigating the world in ways that might also be more recognizable to a neurodivergent community than he might realize. And then he makes the argument for us because he's the president right now, today, and he's navigating the world the same way we would. So it's quite possible it could happen. Let's talk about what he didn't talk about and what the research actually says about ADHD brains or dyslexic brains and high stake environments, pattern recognition. ADHD brains make connections between what seems like unrelated information faster and more often than many neurotypical brains. And it's actually like measurable. It shows up in brain imaging. We've seen this. So in leadership or in business, crisis, or like strategy, the ability to see a pattern before anybody else in the room, that's worth more than almost any other skill, or as much as, like hyper focus under pressure. The same brain cannot sit through a routine meeting, will sometimes not leave the building until, a crisis is solved. That's that doesn't show a deficit. That's like an extra feature on your car. That's big picture thinking. Most neurodivergent people like myself, they'll tell you we struggle with details. But what we also tell you is that we are extraordinary at seeing where something's going, kind of predicting that, what it might become, why it matters. It's kind of like a vision almost. That vision is the thing that separates managers from leaders. Every neurodivergent person in this audience has spent their whole life probably being told in 100 different ways that, like, you're not enough. Maybe not those exact words, but implying also, here we are. Here we are. And here are all those people also, that built all those things anyways. They all showed up anyways. They navigated a world that was not exactly designed for their brain, but kept going and killed it. They killed it. This isn't a disqualification for leadership. There's so many leaders out there. This is it based on all those people I named off and those things. It's like a prerequisite. I have ADHD. I was not someone the school system was designed for. I struggled in school. I still struggle in school. I spent a significant part of my life being made to feel like something was off or wrong with me. That's weird to say. And here's what I want to say to that. Everything I've built, this business, this community, the work I do every day with neurodivergent people and their families, none of it happened in spite of my ADHD. It happened because of how my brain works, the way I see connections other people might miss or overlook, or I don't know, maybe not pay attention to. The intensity and passion I can bring to things I care about is massive. I have this ability to stay inside a problem until it's solved if I care about it. My son has ADHD. He's 10 years old. And we just actually recently had a conversation, just the two of us, about ADHD. And, I'd been thinking about that conversation ever since. The amount of clarity he has about his own brain at 10 years old, like the insight, the way he understands things about how he thinks that most adults, they just never develop the language for. I mean, I could be biased, I'm dad, but he's going to be extraordinary. Again, not in spite of his brain, but because of his brain. And we need kids like him to know that. Now, I hope I'm talking directly to somebody right here for a second. If you're somebody who has ADHD, you're neurodivergent, dyslexic, if you're a parent, or, your kid is nearby and you heard what the president said this week, and like me, something in you went quiet, maybe something sank. I want to talk to you. Here's what's true. The list of people with learning disabilities and ADHD who actually changed the world is absolutely longer than the list of people who told them that they could not change the world. Churchill led a nation through its darkest moments. Einstein completely rewrote physics. Branson built an empire. Steve Jobs changed how we communicate with people. Walt Disney gave the world imagination, the one thing they said he didn't have. Woodrow Wilson, he sat in the fucking Oval Office. And millions of people that you'll never hear about do it also, who built businesses and led teams and raised incredible kids. They figured it out even when every system around them was saying they couldn't or wasn't built for them. Our brains they're not broken. We're wired different, and different isn't less. That's not the same thing. I know many times the school system has always made us kind of feel that way. And I know some teachers have not made you feel that way, and some have made you feel amazing. But this week, the president, he didn't do that. He's wrong. All of these people are absolutely wrong. And you need to know that you're going to figure out your brain. And when you do, when you find the right environment and you find the right supports and the right people to surround yourself with, there's very little you won't be able to do. I've literally seen it happen. I feel like I live it. I see it in my son and my daughter every day, every day. So this is where I land with it. I don't want people to be angry. You know, anger is like, anger is not useful, maybe 5 minutes. And then it stops building anything. What I'm hoping is I'm hoping that you'll take time to understand your brain, not the label, not the diagnosis, but your actual brain, what it needs, where it struggles, and where it's also quietly extraordinary, right? That's the work. And that is what I help. That's what I help people to do. And if you want to understand your specific brain, not like a generic checklist, but what's actually happening in your nervous system. And you want to see a mapping. You want to see what your brain is doing, like why you do what you do. Then there's a link in the description. I had a really good time talking about this, probably mostly because I needed to get it off my chest. And so I'm glad I had a place like this to do it. And I hope that many of you felt the same way I do, and that together we can fight for the same change for the neurodivergent communities. Now, make sure you subscribe. And if this helped out in any way, make sure you leave a comment too.